Why did moonshiner Pinky Dobson try to kill Sheriff Buford Pusser? Hey, I'd like to welcome everybody back to the Buford Pusser University of Criminal Justice. And today I want to take all these minds full of mush and try to educate people, as we do here at the university, into people who know the real story. So today let's address the story of Pinky Dobson. Now, if you'll remember from the movie Walking Tall, Part 2, Dobson was a moonshiner who worked for John Witter, and John Witter controlled all of the activities, illegal activities going on in McNairy County. Well, Witter wanted Pusser gone, so he had Pinky Dobson to do the task. Now, Pinky came up with all such sorts of great ideas. You know, he had Ray Henry put a bomb under Buford's hood. Didn't work. Had Stud Pardee try to take care of him in a car chase. That didn't work. And so one day, when Buford, Carl Pusser, and a bunch of lumbermen were going to arrest Pinky while he was moonshining there by the river, Buford was out in a little boat, pulled a string of logs across the waterway, and Dobson ran into him, was injured. Well, now you'll recall a little bit later in the movie when Dobson was in the hospital, his girlfriend Ruby brought a rope up to him, concealed under her clothing, and Dobson got it, was able to scale down the outside of the hospital through the window and made an escape, even though he was in a guarded room. Now, a little bit later in the movie, it shows that Pusser and a TBI agent are chasing after Dobson, and shots are exchanged. That Buford fires one shot that goes through the back of the car and hits Dobson in the back, and Dobson has to stop, and they arrest him. Okay, that is all baloney. Now, first of all, there was no Pinky Dobson, there was no John Witter, there was no Ray Henry, there was no Stud Pardee. All those characters were fictional, and they just tried to make it appear that Buford was under all this intense pressure and danger that just simply didn't exist. So what they did was take some of the things that happened to a real life person, Paul David English, and they manufactured the Pinky Dobson character after a couple of things that happened with Paul David. Now, I called Paul David one time. We spoke for quite a while. And when I first called him, he was cautious about talking to me. And he asked me what I wanted to know about Buford. And I said, just the truth, whatever that is. I don't care. Good, bad, indifferent, as long as it's the truth. And he hesitated for a minute and then kind of laughed and said, well, I thought you were one of them. And I said, well, one of them who? And he said, oh, it's like here recently I had, I won't call his name out, a call and say he wanted me to come down to the Pusser Festival and tell some stories about Buford, because he said I'd had a lot of interaction with Buford. And he said I agreed to do it. He said I wasn't wild about it because I'm not a public speaker, but they were supposed to gather a bunch of people at the Marty, and I was going to tell them all these stories. And he said, just before I was supposed to do this individual stopped me and said, now, we're here to honor Buford, and we don't want to tell anything negative about it. And Paul David said, I didn't know what I was going to say then. But being that as it may, what happened to Paul was something very similar to what happened to Pinky Dobson in the movie, the fictitious character. And now, Paul David, when he and Buford first encountered each other, it was over a murder charge. Paul David was in from the military. He was on leave, visiting home, about to go back. He decided he'd make one last trip down to the state line and have a little fun. And while he was there, he said he got into it with another individual, Stanley Fowler, and said they had words, big time trouble that night, but said, both left. He went back to his father's home, spent the night, and when he got up the next morning, he heard the sound of a motorcycle, and he said it was Fowler pulled up in the yard. And he said, I opened the door and looked at him. He said, I just knew there was going to be trouble. And he said, I looked down beside the door. There's a rifle there. So I just picked it up, shot him right off that motorcycle. Now, it didn't kill Fowler immediately. Fowler suffered for a while before he passed away. Now, of course, English was arrested on murder charges and convicted. And he spent some time in the McNairy County Jail as such. And said while he was there, he was a trustee, that while he was there, he had the run of the jail. He did some maintenance work, cleaning, just whatever needed to be done. And that got him out of his cell a lot. So he could move about freely about the jail itself. One of the things that he could do was go out on the roof of the courthouse, because it was at the jail was at the very top of the courthouse. And he said he got to thinking about it. So when his wife came to visit him one time, she was all the time bringing food to eat, because naturally the food in the jail is not that great. And they would always check it, of course, looking for anything that might be contraband, but never found anything. So after a while, they just stopped checking her. And Paul David convinced her that she ought to put a rope around her waist and bring it up to him. And she did. And one day, while he was making one of his little excursions out to the roof of the county courthouse, he threw the rope over the side and managed to scale down the wall and escape. Now, much like in the movie, he was pursued by Sheriff Pusser, only instead of a TBI agent in the car was the Corinth chief of police, Art Murphy. And they got in a little road chase with English. Shots were fired, according to the newspapers that I've been able to get. And, they indicate that there was a chase that went a little ways through the countryside, and that Buford finally fired into the back of English's car, and one of the bullets went through, hit him in the near the spine, and partially paralyzed him. So they didn't think that English was going to make it for a while. After that, quite a while, when English has some freedom, he's done his time, whatever, according to, now keep in mind, this is Paul David's story that he told me. Part of it's been verified, part of it hasn't. So you're going to have to make up your own mind what parts to believe. But he said that, he was at Paul Moore's one place on Highway 57, and said Buford pulled up and walked in as he was walking out. And he finally just asked Buford, said, Buford, when you shot me and wounded me, said it partially paralyzed me. I haven't been able to find work since. Nobody wants to hire me because, I'm half crippled. He says, so I've heard that you'll let people make moonshine. And said, Pusser stood there and thought about it for a minute. And he said, well, if I did so, where would you put your steel? Paul David told him where he had a location picked out. Said Buford told him, no, you put it on your dad's place. And here's where you'll buy your worm, which is the copper coil that's used on steel. Here's where you'll buy your sugar. Here's how much you can make. Here's how much you can charge for it. And here's who you'll sell it to. And I get $1 a gallon for everything you produce. And now, if you can believe this story, Paul David said that he realized that he was labor and Buford was management. But he said, I never made so much money in my life. He went on to say that Buford would occasionally send Petey Plunk around to check on what he was doing and make sure that he was following his guidelines and all this. And that went on for some time, apparently. Now, part of this has been confirmed by a former employee there at the courthouse, and that pertains especially to the escape, how all that occurred, and English being shot. As far as the moonshine part, uh, you just have to decide for yourself if it's true or not. But at any rate, uh, that's a story that Paul David English gave me. And, you know, he also told me that Buford had fairly good side at times. Said at Christmas, while he was in the McNairy County Jail, he said, I thought my mom was going to die, that this might be the last time I'd be able to see her on Christmas. And said, I asked Buford if he would let me out of jail so I could spend Christmas Day with my mother. And he said, no, I can't do that. But he said, I'll tell you what, if you will be ready Christmas morning, I'll come by, pick you up, I'll take you out there to see her. He said, I got ready. I didn't know if Buford was going to make it or not. He said, but sure enough, along about 9 o'clock, here comes Buford. Said, we get in the car, we drive down to Mickey and go to my mom's house, but she wasn't there. So I went to my uncle's house and said, when we got there, Buford uh, and I went in. Mom was there. He said, I thought we'd stay for just a few minutes, but we stayed quite a while. He said, matter of fact, we had Christmas dinner there, stayed a while after lunch, took a few photographs, and he said, finally, we left. And while we're in the car driving back to Selmer, Buford asked me, said, are you in a hurry to get back to jail? And Paul said, I kind of laughed and said, well, who's in a hurry to get back to jail? He said, so we took a detour and went down to New Hope Road where the ambush took place. And he had asked me if I'd ever been there. And he said, yeah, I've been there, but it's been a while. And he said, during that drive, Buford reached up over the sun visor, had a handful of photos and gave them to me. And he said, I looked at them and they were photos of Pauline, top of her head blown off. And he said, I'm kind of amazed at what I was seeing. He said, when we got there, Buford told me all how it happened, how this car came chasing him down, stopped, how that Pauline was killed. He said, what bothered me is he didn't seem to have a bit of trouble telling that story. No remorse, no feelings of sadness. He was just very matter of factly about it. And he said, I began to wonder if he had taken me out there to get rid of me. He said, then all of a sudden he just looked at me and said, well, Paul, you ready to get back to jail? And Paul said, yep, I am ready to go. Anyway, said, went back to jail and that was it. But Paul was an interesting character. Now, like I say, I had to wonder if everything he was telling me is true. Some of it I verified, some of it I couldn't. He was very matter of factly about the shooting of Stanley Fowler. He had no problem telling me, yeah, I killed him. So his story about escaping from the jail, a former employee there told me, yeah, that's pretty much the way it happened. So was his story about being allowed to make moonshine true? I don't know. He told it in the same tone, this had the same ring to his voice as he told me everything else. So it's kind of like I say with the Pusser story. If you really want to learn the truth, you have to start with a clean slate, listen to the stories, look at the evidence, see what can be verified, what can't. Looking at that rather than the legend, and you'll get closer to knowing the true story. And this is just part of it. Pinky Dobson never existed. Ray Henry never existed. John Witter never existed. Stud Pardee, same thing. All these were just fictitious characters made to look like Buford was a bigger law enforcement officer than he ever really was. So believe what you will, but there's the story that I've got to tell. So, at any rate, that's going to be it for today. And I might mention as well that Luke Askew played the role of Pinky Dobson in the movie, did a pretty good job. I thought that John Davis Chandler played a good job in the role of Ray Henry, but you know, there you have it. I didn't think a whole lot of Walking Tall Part 2. I thought it was kind of hokey. Had a lot of things in there that really made you seriously doubt that they could all be true. For me, Final Chapter was even worse. The stories went downhill as the more they were told. But you have to keep in mind, all these characters were fictitious. About the only real people in the story were the members of the Pusser family, and one or two of the other actors. For instance, Lloyd Tatum played the prosecutor in Walking Tall Part 1, and he played a TBI man in another movie. So there you have that. In the original Walking Tall movie, one of the plunks played the foreman of the jury that found Buford not guilty of robbing and the Plantation Club, or the Lucky Spot as it was called in that movie. So they didn't even name the locations correctly. And all that probably has to do with some sort of liability uh, legal situations. They didn't want to get sued by using actual names that when they couldn't prove what they were saying as being true. So there you have it. At any rate, we'll be back with a Saturday short. This one's going to be about a follow up on the Dixie Mafia, where we're going to talk about some of the real people, a couple of them that did come down to the state line a time or two, but that there was no connection between them and Pusser in any way. But until then, just remember, the truth has no agenda.